The chamber doors opened before I was ready. Not that I expected to be ready. Nobody warned me that Apex Prime smelled like burnt copper and something older, something that had no name in any human language. Nobody warned me that the ceiling of the Grand Deliberation Hall was so high that clouds formed near the top, actual clouds, thin and pale gray, drifting between columns of carved stone that had been standing for longer than humanity had been writing words. Nobody warned me that when 600 alien eyes turned toward the door at the same moment, the sound of that movement, the collective rustle and shift of scales and feathers and exoskeletal plates, would feel like a physical pressure against my chest. I walked in anyway. My name is Soren Vale. I was 43 years old, born in Bristol, trained in international law at Edinburgh, posted to Galactic affairs after 15 years of work that most humans considered either heroic or deeply misguided depending on their mood. I had spent 8 of those years learning to read Veth facial expressions, 7 learning the tonal grammar of Crystari formal speech, and roughly 4 days preparing for the specific situation I was now walking into. 4 days was not enough. The hall was circular. Everything in Galactic Council architecture was circular, because every founding species had independently arrived at the conclusion that circles suggested equality. It was a nice idea. It was also, like most nice ideas in political architecture, a lie dressed up in stone. The 5 great thrones of the council sat elevated on a raised platform at the far end of the room, and no amount of circular geometry could disguise the fact that they were thrones, that they were higher than everything else, and that the being sitting in the center one was looking at me the way a collector looks at something small and interesting in a jar. High Arbiter Veth Callius was ancient. I knew from the briefing files that he was somewhere between 400 and 600 years old, the uncertainty existing because the Veth did not count time the way humans did, and found our questions about their age mildly offensive. He was tall, even seated. His skin was the deep blue-black of deep ocean water, and his eyes were silver, completely silver, no pupil visible, which meant he was either very calm or preparing to do something I would not enjoy. The Veth had 2 emotional states that produced silver eyes. I had not been able to determine which one was currently active. Around the circular floor, arranged in tiered seating that rose toward the walls, sat the diplomatic representatives of approximately 260 species. Some were members of the council. Most were not. They were here because the summons had gone out, because when the Galactic Council called a species containment hearing, attendance was expected, and when attendance was expected under council law, it was not truly optional. I found my seat. It was a single chair, placed in the center of the floor, facing the elevated platform. There was no table in front of it. There was no lectern. There was nothing to put my hands on, nothing to hide behind, nothing to suggest that the being sitting in that chair was anything other than the subject of this proceeding. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap and looked directly at Veth Callius. He let the silence go on for a long time. I later calculated it at 94 seconds. I know this because I was counting, slowly and deliberately, the way my father taught me to count during moments of pressure. My father had been a deep-sea diver before he retrained as a marine engineer. He had told me once that the most dangerous thing a diver could do when something went wrong was to rush. The ocean, he said, did not care how fast you panicked. It only noticed what you did. At 94 seconds, Veth Callius spoke. His voice came through the translation membrane embedded in my left ear as a low, measured sound, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed, not because it was loud, but because it had never needed to be. Ambassador Vale of the human species, he said, you have been called before this council under the authority of Containment Protocol 7, Provision 14, which grants the Council of 5 the standing to act in the interests of galactic stability when a developing civilization demonstrates patterns of expansion, militarization, or resource acquisition that the Council deems inconsistent with the peace of the broader community. I had read Protocol 7. I had read it 11 times. I had also read every application of it in the 4,000 years of Council records that were available to non-member species, which was not all of them, but was enough. The Council has reviewed the full record of human activity in galactic space over the preceding 82 years, Veth Callius continued. We have found this record to contain elements of concern. He did not specify what those elements were. He did not need to. The document had already been transmitted to my communicator the evening before, a dense and carefully constructed list of human actions that could be read, if you squinted at them from a particular angle, as threatening. Humanity had built 7 jump gates without council oversight. Humanity had expanded its trade routes into 3 sectors that the council had not formally opened to non-member species, though they had also not formally closed them. Humanity had developed propulsion technology that exceeded the level the council considered appropriate for a species of our age. And humanity had, in the most recently flagged item, declined to share the full specifications of that propulsion technology with the council's scientific registry. All of this was true. None of it was, in my honest assessment, actually a threat to galactic peace. It was, however, a very convenient list for a council that had specific plans for what it wanted to do with the space humanity currently occupied. The council has determined, Vethkalius said, that in accordance with Protocol 7, the following measures will be implemented with respect to the human species, effective upon your formal acceptance today. He read the terms. The first term was the decommissioning of all human border fleets within 12 months. Not a reduction, a full decommissioning, with council inspectors overseeing the process. The second term was the surrender of all jump gate technology, schematics and operational data to the council's central archive, after which human use of jump gate travel would require council approval on a case-by-case basis. The third term was the establishment of a council-appointed guidance warden, a senior official from one of the 5 founding species, who would be stationed on Earth and would hold advisory authority over all human decisions related to space expansion, military development, and interstellar trade. Advisory authority, that was the phrase they used. In the 4,000 years of Protocol 7's existence, no species that had accepted a guidance warden had ever successfully distinguished between advisory authority and actual authority. The warden's recommendations had a way of becoming requirements. It was a very elegant system when you looked at it from the outside. The chamber was quiet when he finished. The quiet was the listening kind, the kind that leaned forward slightly. I looked at Vethkalius. He looked back at me with his silver eyes and said, "The council will receive your formal acceptance now." He said it that way, not as a question, not even as an instruction, as a statement of what was about to happen, the same way you might say the sun will rise tomorrow. I took a slow breath. "With respect, High Arbiter," I said, "I would like to request a recess of 72 hours before Earth's response is formally entered into the record." The silence changed quality. It was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. The kind that happens when something unexpected occurs in a space that is not accustomed to unexpected things. Vethkalius tilted his head by approximately 3 degrees. For a Veth, that was a significant movement. "You wish to consult with your government?" "Yes," I said. "I believe that is standard diplomatic procedure for decisions of this scope." He looked at me for a long moment. I held his gaze. I had practiced holding the gaze of Veth dignitaries for 2 years, before I could do it without blinking at the wrong moment. "The recess is granted," he said finally. 72 hours. The council will receive your formal acceptance at that time. Not your response. Your formal acceptance. I nodded, stood, and walked back toward the chamber doors. As I walked, I was aware of the hundreds of eyes following me. I was aware of the Crystari ambassador leaning toward his aide and saying something in a frequency too low for my translation membrane to catch. I was aware of the Pale Dominion delegation not moving at all, which was their version of agitation. I was also aware of one other thing, a detail I had noticed when I first sat down in that lone chair in the center of the floor. There was no podium for rebuttal. There was no secondary seat for a responding statement. The chamber had been designed with one speaking position for the council and one position for the subject being addressed. It was not a courtroom. It was not a debate. It was a hall, built specifically for announcements and acceptances, for the speaking of terms, and the receiving of compliance. Nobody had ever needed a rebuttal podium because nobody had ever given one. The doors closed behind me. My aide, a young man named Owen Clark who had been with me for 3 years, and who had the particular gift of remaining calm in situations that warranted the opposite, fell into step beside me in the corridor. "How did it go?" he asked. "They gave me 3 days to inform humanity of our surrender," I said. "No one, not even me, believed I would use those 3 days to start a war." Owen said nothing for a moment. Then, "Should I book a channel to Earth?" Yes, I said. Secure, highest encryption, and Owen, make sure the cabinet is present. All of them. He nodded, and moved ahead to make the arrangements. I walked slowly down the corridor of Apex Prime, past walls that had been polished by 10,000 years of treaty and submission, and I thought about my father, and the ocean, and the simple fact that the most important thing you could do when everything went wrong was to refuse to rush. I was not rushing. But I was also not planning to go back into that chamber and say what they expected me to say. The call connected at 0300 hours Earth time, which meant the cabinet members had all been pulled out of sleep or whatever the equivalent was for people who had stopped sleeping properly the moment the summons arrived. Secretary General Laura Fenn appeared first on my screen, her gray hair pulled back without ceremony, her reading glasses still on, a cup of tea sitting untouched at her elbow. Then the others came online one by one. Defense Secretary Adele Morrow, Chief of Strategic Operations Admiral Yemi Okafor, Director of Intelligence Colin Reese, Foreign Affairs Director Nadia Aslan, and 6 other faces I knew well enough to read before they spoke. Nobody said good morning. Tell us, said Fenn. I told them. I gave them the terms exactly as Veth Callius had read them, without softening the language and without adding my own interpretation. I had learned long ago that people make better decisions when they receive information clean. Every instinct in diplomacy pushes you toward framing, toward presentation, toward choosing the words that guide the listener toward the conclusion you have already reached. I resisted that instinct. These 8 billion people deserved to hear it straight. When I finished, the silence on the call lasted longer than the silence in the council chamber had. That told me something. Cabinet members did not do silence unless they were doing mathematics, the kind that involved futures and consequences and large numbers of people. Adele Morrow spoke first. The fleet decommissioning timeline is 12 months? Yes, I said. And the jump gate surrender is immediate upon acceptance? Within 90 days of formal acceptance. Council inspectors would arrive within the first 30. She nodded slowly. She was not surprised. I could see that she was confirming what she had already calculated, checking the arithmetic against a model she had been running in her head since before I called. Colin Reese pulled up something off screen. The guidance warden provision, he said. Advisory authority. Walk me through what that has looked like historically. I walked him through it. The Dorothi species, who had accepted a warden 2,000 years ago, now had no independent military capacity and exported 60% of their mineral output to Crystari markets, at prices the Crystari set. The Solvari, who had accepted one 1,500 years ago, had a warden's office embedded in their planetary government that had, over 8 centuries, quietly expanded its advisory scope to include education, infrastructure, and scientific research. The Solvari technically retained full sovereignty. Technically. I watched the faces on the call as I spoke. The room was doing math. All of them. What is the realistic trajectory? Said Nadia Aslan.
If we comply.
30 years before the border fleet decommissioning creates a security gap the Council can use to justify expanded warden authority. 40 years before the jump gate monopoly makes our trade routes dependent on Council approval. 60 years before the resource economics shift far enough that human space becomes a net exporter of raw materials at controlled prices. I paused. I want to be precise about this. Compliance does not end humanity as a species. It ends humanity as an independent civilization. We would persist. We would simply persist the way the Dorothi persist. Another silence. Admiral Okafor had not spoken yet. She was a tall woman, with close-cropped hair, and the habit of sitting very still when she was thinking, so still that on video calls people sometimes assumed she had frozen. She had not frozen. She was reading something on a screen I could not see, and her expression was the flat, clean expression of someone who has already arrived at a conclusion and is now deciding how to present it. Soren, she said, how much do they know about us? I knew immediately what she meant. Their intelligence files put our active fleet at roughly 400 warships. They believe our most advanced propulsion system is the Mark VI drive, which we publicly registered with the Council 8 years ago. They have no record of the longbow systems. Okafor looked at someone off screen and said, quietly, pull it up. I had heard of Operation Longbow. Every senior diplomat in Galactic Affairs had heard of it, in the way you hear of contingency plans, that nobody believes will ever be activated. It had been written 12 years ago, by a small strategic planning team that had looked at the Council's history and decided, against every official foreign policy position, that humanity should prepare for the possibility of direct confrontation. The team had been considered alarmist. Their report had been filed and not discussed in public session. It was being pulled up now. The plan was built on 3 assumptions, Okafor said, still reading. First, that the Council underestimates our military capacity because they have never had reason to look hard at a species they consider non-threatening. Second, that our jump gate technology gives us a response time advantage in our own space that no Council fleet can match. Third, that the Council's unity is more fragile than it appears. Specifically, that the Marathi Republic has been a reluctant member since the Third Expansion Accord and could be moved under the right circumstances. She looked directly at the camera. All 3 assumptions are still valid. Director Reese added something I had been waiting for someone to say. The 42 non-member species who received our broadcast signal this morning. The summary we sent of the Protocol 7 terms before the hearing. We have responses from 31 of them already. None of them are supportive of the Council's position. I had sent that broadcast the night before the hearing, before I even walked into the chamber. It was the kind of action that could be called either bold or reckless depending entirely on what happened next. I had calculated the odds for a long time before sending it. The Marathi withdrawal from the last 2 council sessions, said Fen quietly. She was looking at something in her files. Is that connected? I believe so, I said. Their senior representative, an official named Dava Sane, made 3 separate requests over the last year for a review of Protocol 7's historical application record. The Council denied all 3 requests without explanation. Dava Sane has been quiet since then. Quiet in the way that experienced diplomats are quiet when they are waiting for the right moment. Fen set down her tea. She looked at me through the screen with the expression she used when she had already made a decision, but was waiting to see if the room had arrived at the same place. I had seen that expression before. It meant she was about to stop consulting and start leading. What do you need from us? She said. That was the question. Not what do you recommend? Not what are our options? What do you need? I told her. I needed Admiral Okafor to move the longbow assets to pre-agreed positions without any public signal. I needed Reese to prepare a full intelligence package, every piece of documented evidence we had of the Council's selective application of Protocol 7 across 4,000 years, the resource acquisitions, the trade coercions, the slow institutional erosion of every species that had ever said yes. I needed that package transmitted to every non-member species in our contact database simultaneously, not as a call to action, just as information, the kind of information that people deserve to have. And I needed one more thing. I need to know, I said, whether Earth authorizes me to refuse. The room went very still. Fen looked at me for a long time. 8 billion people, breathing somewhere behind her face. 8 billion people who had spent 80 years building something in the stars, who had buried their dead in foreign wars and explored places no human eye had seen, and argued about the cost of every ship and treaty and sacrifice that had brought us this far. 8 billion people who had no idea that the decision was being made right now, in a room none of them would ever see. Ambassador Vale, said Laura Fen, and her voice was quiet and absolutely certain. Do what you think humanity would be proud of. The call ended. I sat in my cabin on Apex Prime for a long time after the screen went dark. The station hummed around me with the machinery of 1,000 years of diplomacy, all of it built on the assumption that small things said yes to large ones. Outside my small porthole, the stars were extraordinarily still. I thought about my father. I thought about the ocean. Then I opened my communicator and began to write. I wrote until the words were right. Not impressive words. Not historical words, just clear ones. The kind you could say out loud without feeling like you were performing. The kind that would still sound true when people read them 100 years from now, in whatever future was on the other side of what I was about to do. I went to sleep that night knowing that when I walked back into that chamber, I would be carrying the weight of 8 billion people who had decided they would rather face whatever came next than live the slow alternative. The alarm woke me 4 hours later. I dressed carefully. A plain dark suit, no decorations, no flags, nothing ceremonial. I wanted to walk into that chamber looking like exactly what I was. One person from one planet, standing up to say something that needed to be said. Owen was waiting outside my door with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me without speaking. "How are you feeling?" he asked, after a moment. "Like someone who knows what they are going to say," I told him. He nodded. "That is better than most people get." We walked toward the chamber together. The grand deliberation hall looked the same as it had 72 hours earlier. Same circular floor, same tiered seating rising to the high walls, same thin clouds drifting near the ceiling, same 600 eyes turning toward the doors as I entered. Same single chair in the center of the floor, facing the elevated platform where the 5 thrones sat. Same silver eyes watching me from the center throne. I walked to the chair. I did not sit down. That was the first unexpected thing. The protocol required the subject of the hearing to be seated before the council addressed them. It was a small physical arrangement, but it was not accidental. A seated figure faces an elevated platform from below. A standing figure changes the geometry slightly. Not much, but enough. Veth Callius noticed. The tilt of his head was smaller this time, only a degree or 2, but I caught it. I set my communicator on the floor in front of the chair, not on a podium, because there was no podium for me. Just on the floor, a single flat rectangle of human engineering, placed on the ancient stone of the council's hall. "Ambassador Vale," said Veth Callius, "the council is prepared to receive the formal acceptance of the human species with respect to Protocol 7. He said it exactly the same way as before. Acceptance, not response. A statement of what was about to happen. "High Arbiter," I said, "the human species formally declines." The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had heard in that hall, or anywhere else. It was not the listening silence from before, and it was not the surprised silence of a disrupted ceremony. It was deeper than both. It was the silence of a room full of beings who had just encountered something that their mental architecture did not have a category for. I did not stop. Earth formally rejects Protocol 7, Provision 14, as applied to humanity, on the following grounds. I did not need to read from anything. I had written the words until they were inside me. First, Protocol 7 was created to protect galactic stability from genuine threats. In 4,000 years of application, it has been used exclusively against non-member species in resource-rich sectors of space that subsequently became integrated into council member economies. We have the records: 12 species, 12 hearings, 12 guidance wardens appointed. 12 civilizations that now operate as economic dependencies of council members. This is not protection. It is a system, and it is a system we are declining to enter. I watched the chamber. The Crystari delegation was very still. The Pale Dominion representative was doing something with her hands that looked like distress. The Marathi delegate, an official I recognized as Dava Sane from the intelligence files, had sat forward in her seat. "Second," I said, "humanity submitted a formal request 3 years ago for access to Protocol 7's full historical application record. The request was denied without stated reason. Under Article 41 of the Galactic Charter, which the Council wrote, non-member species under protocol review have the right to examine all precedents relevant to their case. The denial of that request was not consistent with the Council's own law. That one landed differently. I could hear the quality of the silence change slightly. Legal arguments did that in chambers like this. Third, I said, Earth has this morning transmitted a full documented account of the 12 historical Protocol 7 cases, with all supporting records currently available, to every non-member species in range. Not as a call to any action, as information, because the beings in this room and beyond it deserve to make decisions with full knowledge of the system they are operating inside. The Crystari senior ambassador made a sound. It was short and controlled, but it was there. Finally, I said, Earth would like to request that Protocol 7 be suspended, pending an independent review of its historical application, conducted by a body that includes non-member species representation. We believe this request is consistent with the Council's own stated values, and with the long-term stability that this institution was created to protect. I looked directly at Veth Callius. We are not your enemy, I said. We are asking you to be consistent with yourselves. The chamber was absolutely still. And then, from the tiered seating on the left side of the hall, Dava Singh of the Marathi Republic rose from her seat and said, in a clear and measured voice, "The Marathi delegation requests a formal recess." It was 5 words. 5 words spoken in a chamber that had not heard a non-council delegate request a procedural action in living memory, but she said them with the confidence of someone who had been waiting a long time for the right moment to say them, and the rules of the council did not technically prohibit a delegate from making the request, because no one had ever needed to write that prohibition. Veth Callius looked at Dava Singh for a long time. "Recess is granted," he said, in a voice that had lost approximately 5% of its certainty. Not much, but I noticed. 2 security officers from the Veth Collective, tall and blue-black like their arbiter, appeared at my side. They were professionally courteous, which was the most unsettling kind. They did not touch me. They simply appeared, and their posture communicated clearly that I would be leaving the chamber floor now. I reached down, picked up my communicator from the floor, and walked with them toward the side door. As I walked, I was aware of the camera drones. There were perhaps 40 of them positioned throughout the hall, broadcasting this hearing to every connected screen in council space. I was aware that most of them were following me rather than the council platform. I did not look at them. I kept my eyes forward and my hands loose at my sides, and I walked at the same pace I had walked in, because my father had taught me that the most important thing about any moment of pressure was how you walked out of it. The side door closed behind me. Owen was waiting in the corridor, and his expression told me he had been watching on a screen somewhere nearby. His eyes were a little wider than usual, which for Owen was equivalent to visible excitement. "The broadcast," he said quietly. 38 responses so far. Positive? 37 positive. 1 neutral. He paused. The neutral one is still reading the documents. Behind me, through the thick walls of the chamber, I heard something. It was not loud. It was more like the sound a structure makes when a weight it has been carrying for a very long time shifts position, not breaking, not collapsing, just moving, the way old things move, when they finally begin to recognize that the world around them is not what it was. I thought it sounded almost like fear. I kept walking. The holding room was small and clean and smelled like recycled air. There were no windows. The door was not locked, which was a careful distinction, because it meant they were calling this something other than imprisonment. Diplomatic courtesy detention. That was the phrase in the formal notification that arrived on my communicator 40 minutes after I left the chamber. I read the notification once, and then pulled up the Galactic Charter on the same screen. Article 73 covered the treatment of diplomatic personnel during active proceedings. Subarticle B was clear. A recognized ambassador could not be held without their explicit consent, except in cases of direct threat to station security. I was not a direct threat to station security. I had stood in a room and delivered a prepared statement. Diplomatic courtesy detention was not a category that existed in the Charter. I documented that. I sent the documentation to 3 places: Colin Reese at Earth Intelligence, the Marathi Diplomatic Mission's public contact address, and the Open Galactic News Registry, where anyone could read it. Then I poured a glass of water from the small dispenser on the wall and sat down to wait. Owen had been taken to a separate room. I had been told, by the Veth security officer who escorted me here, that he was comfortable and unharmed. I believed this not because I trusted the officer, but because detaining a junior diplomatic aide served no purpose, and council operations rarely wasted energy on things that served no purpose. 18 hours passed. I spent them reading. I reread the Protocol 7 case histories. I went through the Marathi Republic's public voting record in council sessions over the past 30 years, looking for the pattern I expected to find, and finding it. Gradual withdrawal, positions that walked back from full council support, an increasing frequency of abstentions on votes involving Protocol 7 applications. Dava Singh had been the Republic's council delegate for 9 of those years. She had abstained on 4 protocol hearings. In council politics, abstention was a position. It was the position of someone who believed something was wrong, but had not yet found the moment to say so clearly. I thought about what it must be like to be Dava Singh, to sit in that chamber for 9 years and watch 4 species walk through the same door and come out the other side diminished, and to know the rules well enough to know that the rules were being used in a way the rules were not supposed to allow, and to keep waiting for the moment when saying so would matter, rather than simply ending your career. I wondered if watching a human diplomat stand up and deliver a prepared refusal into the silence of that ancient hall had felt, to her, like the moment she had been waiting for. At hour 18, my communicator lit up with a message from Owen, sent from his room on a channel I recognized as a secondary secure line we had established for exactly this kind of situation. Longbow assets in position. The message read, all 12. Okafor sends her regards. I set the communicator down carefully on the table. 12 ships. That was what the message said. But I knew what 12 ships meant in the context of Operation Longbow. It did not mean 12 warships drifting in open space. It meant 12 ships positioned at pre-calculated points along every major Council approach vector to human space, each one carrying weapons systems the Council had never observed or catalogued, each one crewed by people who had trained for this specific scenario for years, and who understood that their job was not to fire first, but to make the cost of firing first so clear that nobody would. The thing about humans that most species never quite understood was that we were not naturally the largest or the strongest or the oldest. We had survived on a difficult planet by becoming very good at one specific thing, making it expensive to fight us. Not impossible, not hopeless, just expensive, in the way that eventually made any adversary stop and recalculate. The Council's intelligence on Earth put our active fleet at 400 warships. The real number was higher. The Council believed our most advanced drive technology was the Mark VI. The real technology was not catalogued anywhere in any registry they had access to. The Council assumed our response time in our own space matched standard galactic fleet deployment speeds. It did not. We had 80 years in galactic space, and 3 billion years of evolution on a planet that made the cosmos look mild. We had been preparing for the possibility of a moment like this since we were still arguing about whether to build our first jump gate. Not because humanity wanted conflict, because humanity had read every history ever written, on Earth and elsewhere, and the histories all said the same thing. Civilizations that cannot protect their independence eventually lose it, and losing it is not the end, just the beginning of a much longer and quieter kind of loss. At hour 21, a knock came at the door. I said, "Come in," and the door opened to reveal not a security officer, but a small figure I recognized after a moment as one of the Mirathi diplomatic staff, a young official with rust-colored skin and large dark eyes, who was carrying a data chip and an expression of extremely controlled nervousness. She held out the chip. "From Representative Dava Sane," she said. "Not official, personal." I took the chip and inserted it into my communicator. The message was 3 sentences. The first sentence said that the Mirathi Republic had formally requested an emergency session of the Council's general body to address the question of Protocol 7's review process. The second sentence said that 6 other non-member delegations currently present on Apex Prime had co-signed the request. The third sentence said that she hoped I was comfortable and that the water dispenser in that room was known to be unreliable. I sat with that message for a moment. Then I looked up at the Mirathi aide, who was still standing in the doorway. "Tell Representative Dava Sane," I said, "that the water is fine, and thank her." The aide nodded and left. 40 minutes later, my communicator showed me something that I had not expected to see for several more hours. A live news feed from the station's broadcast network, showing the exterior docking port of Apex Prime from an exterior camera angle. In the feed, a ship was visible against the distant stars. Then 2 ships. Then, over the course of a few minutes, 14 more. Human ships, Earthfleet ships, every one of them running full identification transponders, so there was no ambiguity about what they were or where they came from. They were not in a combat formation. They were not weapons hot. They were simply present, in the space around Apex Prime, visible to every sensor on the station, and to every camera drone broadcasting from its exterior. At their center was the largest, a long and serious-looking vessel that I recognized from its design even before the feed showed its registration. The EFS Immovable, Earth's flagship, named not after a quality we hoped to project but after a decision we had made about who we were. My communicator registered an incoming audio signal from the Immovable's bridge. I accepted it. "Soren." Admiral Okafor's voice was exactly as I had heard it in cabinet meetings, measured, unhurried, carrying the specific confidence of someone who has spent a career in situations that required precision under pressure. "How are you holding up?" "Well enough," I said. "You're early." We were in the area. A brief pause. "The station knows we are here. We received 6 hailing attempts in the last 20 minutes. I told them we would be happy to discuss anything they wanted to discuss, but that we were waiting for a response on Ambassador Vale's status first." "And?" "They are thinking about it," she said. Through the holding room wall, I heard something that sounded like increased movement in the corridor. Footsteps moving at a speed that was faster than administrative pace. "Yemi," I said, "when this is over, however it ends, I need you to know that watching those ships show up on a news feed from a windowless room was the finest thing I have seen in 20 years of this work." There was a pause. When she spoke again, her voice had something in it that was not quite a smile but was close to one. "The Council has spent 10,000 years building a galaxy that obeyed," she said. "It never once considered what would happen when someone showed the galaxy that it did not have to." I heard the lock on my door click open. Not a guard this time. The door swung inward on its own, which meant the access restriction had been remotely lifted from a station control panel somewhere. I stood up, straightened my jacket, picked up my communicator, and walked out. 6 months moved with the particular speed of months that contain things that cannot be undone. I was standing at a window on the 3rd floor of the United Nations Conference Building in Geneva when I first fully understood that. Not at the council chamber, not in a diplomatic cable, or a news briefing, or any of the 100 tense conversations that had filled the space between then and now. Here, at a window, watching the transport ships land on the meadow that had been converted into an arrival field, each one carrying a delegation that no human being had ever expected to meet on Earth's soil. 43 species. I counted the ships as they came down, small and large, some familiar in design, some unlike anything in our catalogs. The Mirathi shuttle was identifiable by its characteristic swept fins, pale silver against the morning sky. Behind it came a vessel I had to look up in the reference files, from a species called the Teth, who had been non-members of the Council for 2,000 years, and had apparently been waiting with considerable patience for a reason to come out from under that status. The Galactic Council had not gone to war. The Crystari hegemony had wanted to. In the 72 hours after the standoff at Apex Prime, their council representative had delivered 3 separate statements calling for a formal military response to what they termed human diplomatic aggression. The Veth Collective had met with their own strategic council, run the numbers, reviewed the sensor data from the 15 Earth ships that had appeared around Apex Prime, and quietly declined to commit forces. The Pale Dominion had asked for more time to assess. The Urun Hive had not responded to internal council communication at all, which among the Urun meant they were processing and had not reached collective consensus. Without consensus, there was no council military authorization. That was in their own founding charter, the same document I had cited at the hearing. Joint military action required agreement from all 5 founding species. The Veth's refusal to move was a wall that the Crystari could not get around. So the Council had done the thing that old institutions do when confronted with something their architecture cannot handle. They had issued statements. They had invoked Protocol 7 formally, entering the declaration into the official record that humanity was in violation. They had commissioned a review committee, which was a way of doing something without doing anything, and they had watched, with visible discomfort, as the number of non-member species that formally associated themselves with the Free Species Accord grew from 1 to 7 to 19 to 43 in the space of 6 months. The Accord itself was not a military alliance. I had been careful about that. It was a framework, a commitment to share information, to grant mutual trade access without council mediation, to establish an independent review process for any interspecies disputes, and to collectively support any member species that faced external pressure inconsistent with the rights established in the Galactic Charter. It did not name the Council. It did not need to. The Mirathi Republic was the first to sign. They withdrew from the Council formally, 30 days after the Apex Prime standoff, citing what their official statement called a fundamental incompatibility between the Council's current practice and the principles the Republic had originally joined to uphold. Their seat on the Council had been empty since. 2 smaller civilizations, the Drenathi Compact and the Solvari, who had spent 15 centuries living under the quiet pressure of a guidance warden, followed within the same week. The The Solvari's withdrawal statement was 11 pages long and contained, among other things, a detailed account of every instance over 1,500 years in which their guidance warden's advisory authority had functionally overridden decisions made by the Solvari people about their own civilization. Nobody at the council had expected the Solvari to say anything. The Solvari had been quiet for a very long time. I left the window and walked downstairs to where Owen was coordinating the arrivals, managing the logistical chaos of 43 species with different atmospheric preferences and gravity needs and dietary requirements, all trying to enter the same building without incident. He was doing it with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything, and he had drafted in enough support staff that the system was working, mostly. Dava Sign's delegation is asking about the afternoon session timing, he said when he saw me. Tell them we are flexible. If they need more time to settle in, we push the opening session to tomorrow morning. He nodded and stepped away to pass the message. High Arbiter Veth Callius had requested a private meeting. The request had come through official channels 3 months after Apex Prime, worded with the careful neutrality that senior council officials used when they were doing something that did not have a recognized protocol. I had accepted. The meeting had taken place in a neutral location, a small station operated jointly by 2 non-aligned species, in a room with no camera drones and no official record. He had walked in looking the same as he always looked, ancient, composed, his silver eyes unreadable. We had sat across from each other at a small table, with nothing on it except 2 glasses of water. His first words, after a long silence, had been, "How long have you been planning this?" I had thought about how to answer that question for a long time before the meeting. I could have been diplomatic. I could have given him the version that was technically true but designed to minimize. Instead, I gave him the straight answer, because I thought he deserved it, and because I thought it might actually be useful to him. Since first contact, I said, not this specific moment, not these specific actions, but the preparation, the contingency, the understanding that this conversation might someday happen, since the first time a human read the Galactic Charter and noticed that Protocol 7 existed. He was quiet for a long time. You were afraid of us. We were informed about you, I said. Which is a different thing. Fear is not knowing what something might do. We studied you. We knew what you had done. We took it seriously. Another silence. And the ships, the capabilities your admiral showed. We are not interested in a conflict, I said. We have never been interested in one. What we are interested in is a relationship in which we are a party rather than a subject. He looked at me with those silver eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then, the Accord. Where does it go? That depends on what the Council does next, I said honestly. We did not build the Accord to replace the Council. We built it because species need structures that serve them, and the Council, as it has operated, has not been that for a significant portion of the galaxy's population. If the Council chooses to change, there is room for a different relationship. If it does not, the Accord will grow, because the need for it will grow. Veth Callius did not respond to that directly. He picked up his glass of water, which was the first movement he had made since sitting down, and he drank from it slowly, and then he said, "You are a very young species." "Yes," I said, "we are." "That is not an insult," he said. "It is a concern. Young species make errors that have long consequences. So do old ones," I said. He looked at me. I held his gaze. After a moment, something shifted in his expression. Not much, not enough that anyone without a lot of practice reading Veth faces would have caught it. "Yes," he said, "they do." We had not reached any formal agreement in that meeting. We had not shaken hands, because Veth did not make physical contact with non-Veth in formal settings, and I did not push the gesture. But we had talked for 2 hours, and at the end of it, when I stood to leave, he had said one more thing. "The Protocol 7 Review Committee," he said, "has been instructed to include non-member species consultation in its process. It was not announced publicly, but I thought you should know." I had nodded and left. It was not a victory. It was something smaller and more complicated than a victory. It was the beginning of a different conversation, one that might take decades and might not go anywhere, or might, slowly, go somewhere that mattered. Back in Geneva, I walked through the conference building toward the main hall, where the founding session of the Free Species Accord was going to take place. Through the high windows I could see the meadow outside, the alien ships resting in the afternoon light, some of them leaking gentle atmospheric adjusters into the air around them, small clouds of their own making settling over the green grass of the Swiss countryside. 43 species. Some of them old civilizations that had been suppressed into quiet for so long they had almost forgotten what it felt like to have an independent position on anything. Some of them young, younger than humanity, with only decades in galactic space, and the same early confusion that we had felt, the sense of being inside a system so large and old and settled that questioning it seemed presumptuous. Davasane found me in the corridor outside the main hall. She was shorter than she appeared on screen, and her rust-colored skin was paler at the edges of her face, which I had learned was the Marathi equivalent of visible tiredness. She had not slept well in months. Neither had I. "Ready?" she asked. "Not entirely," I said. She made a sound that was the Marathi equivalent of a dry laugh. "Good. People who are entirely ready for things like this are usually not taking them seriously enough." We walked into the main hall together. The room was full. Not loud, not celebratory, but full, in the way that rooms are full, when the people in them understand what they are here to do, and are taking it seriously. Representatives of 43 species, arranged not in circular seating this time, but in a long, sweeping configuration that had no platform, no elevated position, no single chair in the center of a floor, just tables, arranged so that everyone was at the same level, and everyone could see everyone else. I took my seat. Around me, beings who had traveled from hundreds of light years away settled into theirs. I thought about the council chamber on Apex Prime, with its ancient columns and its ceiling clouds and its single chair. I thought about my father and the ocean, and the simple principle that you did not rush when things went wrong, but you also did not stop moving. I thought about 8 billion people who had decided that a thing worth having was worth the difficulty of keeping it. I thought about what it had cost. Not just the political cost, the maneuvering, and the risk, and the 72 hours of calculations that could have gone differently at any point. I thought about what it would continue to cost, because this was not an ending. It was the first page of something that would take a very long time to write, and there would be setbacks, and the council was not going to become a different institution because of one confrontation, and the galaxy was not going to reorganize itself along more equitable lines, because 43 species had signed a framework in a conference building in Switzerland. But 43 species had signed a framework in a conference building in Switzerland. That was real. That was a thing that had not existed 6 months ago, and existed now. I looked out the windows at the meadow and the ships and the afternoon sky of a planet that had spent 3 billion years trying to destroy the things that lived on it, and had produced, in the end, things that were very difficult to destroy. Davasane called the session to order in her quiet, certain voice. I picked up my pen, old habit, writing by hand. My father had done it too. They had called us young, and reckless, and unworthy of a seat at their table. They had been right about 2 of those things. We had built our own table, and we had left a chair for anyone brave enough to sit down. I started to write.